Layne Staley, the lead vocalist of Alice in Chains, a band that rose from the heart of Seattle's music scene and transformed the course of rock forever. But behind every legendary musician lies a very human story, one brimming with triumph, tragedy, hope, despair, and the often unpredictable elements that form a life. Layne Staley's journey from his early years of childlike wonder to becoming one of the greatest vocal talents of the grunge era is a kaleidoscope of inspiration, cautionary tales, and deeply personal struggles. Born on August 22, 1967 in Bellevue, Washington, Layne found himself in a place and time that would eventually become ground zero for the emerging grunge movement. With parents Philip Blair Staley and Nancy Elizabeth Staley, Layne spent his earliest years in Kirkland, a nearby town where his father sold cars, and later his mother would remarry after a divorce. From the outside, his childhood might have appeared in many ways ordinary, yet the seeds of something extraordinary were already sprouting. When asked later about his earliest memory, Layne recalled being a baby in a crib, gazing upward at a mobile as it spun gently overhead. Even as a toddler, there was a sense of musical resonance swirling around him, a feeling that, sooner or later, he was fated to answer the call of song. The first big shift in his family life came in 1974, when his parents divorced. Then in 1975, Layne's mother married an insurance salesman named Jim Elmer, who already had a child of his own from a previous relationship. While any family shakeup can be tumultuous for a young child, Layne described his early years as mostly carefree. He remembered occasionally wondering where his biological father had gone, but such questions never consumed him. He was too busy running around, playing, exploring, and living in the moment. Ironically, the very man he rarely thought of in those days would return to his life only when Layne had become a rock star. And by then, it would be under far more complicated circumstances. One key moment in Layne's childhood came in 1975 when his stepfather brought him to an Elton John concert in Seattle. This was no ordinary night out. It was for Layne a lightning bolt revelation. He suddenly knew exactly what he wanted to be when he grew up. He wanted to become a rock star. Like so many young people on the threshold of discovering their passions, Layne immersed himself in the music he loved. Initially, it was Elton John, Fleetwood Mac, Billy Joel, melodic sounds that sparked his imagination. But as he moved into his teenage years and began sharing music with his stepbrother Ken, Layne's taste evolved to heavier bands. Ozzy Osbourne, the Scorpions, Van Halen. That primal electricity of guitar riffs and driving drum beats called to him. He tried various instruments, trumpet, cornet, drums, but eventually realized at age 15 that singing was where he felt most alive. His progress as a vocalist wasn't immediate. Those around him would later admit that he had to work to refine his voice, yet his dedication kept growing. A curious spark fueled his transformation from a kid dabbling in brass instruments to a dedicated, aspiring vocalist. Negative feedback. Early on, Layne played drums in a small band that had a different lead singer. This singer told Layne, in no uncertain terms, that he couldn't sing. Feeling wounded by this rejection, Layne abruptly sold his drum kit, purchased a microphone, and vowed to become the best vocalist he could be. It's fascinating how such a pivotal moment, someone else's dismissive comment, proved to be the catalyst that propelled Layne on the exact path he'd ultimately need to follow. Meanwhile, life during his teenage years wasn't all driven by pure ambition. As he dove deeper into rock, Layne also started experimenting with drugs. By the time he reached high school, substance use was creeping into his life, and his grades and academic ambitions quickly fell to the wayside. His passion for music took precedence. He fronted a glam band called Sleaze, which later took on different spellings and forms, and recorded a demo under the guidance of producer Tim Branham, who also helped Layne with basic vocal exercises. This was still the mid-1980s, a time of flamboyant rock ensembles, neon colors, teased hair, and new wave. Layne's early foray with sleaze even led to a local television appearance in 1985, when they briefly discussed the Parents Music Resource Center. A year later, he popped up in a locally distributed film called Father Rock, further signaling that his star was inching up, at least in small ways. Around this time, Layne spent a lot of his days and nights at a place called the Music Bank, a cavernous space in Seattle where local bands could rent rehearsal rooms and sometimes crash overnight if they were broke or too tired to go home. This communal atmosphere might sound like every musician's dream environment, brimming with creativity and camaraderie, but it also came with a darker side, as drugs circulated freely in those rooms. Layne, who was already experimenting, found even more opportunities to indulge. People who stayed there recalled that Layne initially resisted the lure of heroin, opting for any number of other substances instead. But as time wore on, the bandmates who played with Layne noticed his drug use morphing into something more concerning, especially when it began affecting his on-stage performance. By 1987, the glam band once known as Sleaze had evolved into something brand new, Alice in Chains. The name alone contained a little edge, fitting for the heavier, more menacing sound that was beginning to coalesce around Layne's powerhouse vocals and the raw, intricate guitar work of Jerry Cantrell. One pivotal evening that year, Alice in Chains took the stage in Tacoma. Among the spectators was Jerry himself, who had just had his own band, Diamond Lie, break up. Jerry was then playing in a group called Gypsy Rose, alongside bassist Mike Starr. As luck or fate would have it, Layne caught Jerry's attention, and from that moment on, Jerry knew he wanted to team up with him. He would later describe that first time seeing Layne as a revelation. The small, wiry frontman unleashed a vocal presence that Jerry likened to the roar of some 350-pound biker. In that raw, full-throated belt, Jerry heard the future of whatever music he most wanted to create. Layne and Jerry first met in person at a house party later in 1987. Jerry was practically homeless at the time, having left his parents' place, so Layne did something that might surprise those who assume rock stars are all aloof or self-absorbed. He generously invited Jerry to move in with him. Meanwhile, Layne found himself juggling multiple band projects, including one called 40 Years of Hate. But Jerry, along with Mike Starr and drummer Sean Kinney, were plotting to rope Layne into their new band full-time. They placed an ad in a local music magazine inviting vocalists to audition in the same building where Layne was working the front desk. The audition process was so hilariously terrible, one candidate being a male stripper among other misfits, that Layne couldn't resist but volunteer. Hearing how dire the auditioners were through the studio walls, Layne burst into the room, telling them he was in. He quit all his other bands, committing wholeheartedly to the new group that would soon be known definitively as Alice in Chains. Initially, they called themselves Diamond Lie, borrowing Jerry's old band name, but by 1988 they reverted to Alice in Chains. Jerry, Layne, Mike Starr, and Sean Kinney recorded a demo known as the Treehouse Tapes, named for the studio in which it was recorded. Gradually, they began getting attention. Local radio station KISW played their tracks, and as momentum built, Kelly Curtis and Susan Silver, who managed Soundgarden and Mother Love Bone, negotiated a deal with Columbia Records for Alice in Chains. At this point, Layne's personal life took a significant turn as well. Around 1988, he met Demery Parrott, the woman who would become his girlfriend and a major influence on him for years to come. Their relationship was passionate yet tempestuous, marked by engagements, breakups, reconciliations, and heartbreak. In the larger music scene, it wasn't easy for a fresh group to find a producer willing to work on a debut album if the band didn't fit the mold of Guns N' Roses style rock, which was hugely popular at the time. Yet David Jordan, who had produced Jane's Addiction's Nothing Shocking, saw something special in Alice in Chains. He likened their riffs, harmonies, and vibe to Black Sabbath, a high compliment for any band aiming to be heavier and darker than the glam rock norm. The result was Facelift, released in August 1990. Sales were initially underwhelming, around 40,000 copies by spring 1991, but MTV soon picked up the single Man in the Box for its Buzzbin showcase. This exposure rocketed Alice in Chains into the mainstream, establishing Facelift as the first grunge album to reach gold status. Suddenly, Layne found himself recognized at truck stops, asked for autographs, and hailed as one of the most exciting new voices in rock. While the attention thrilled some band members, it unsettled Layne. Demery's mother, Kathleen Austin, would later note how deeply he despised losing his privacy. If he visited an ATM in the middle of the night, local tabloids and magazines might publish a snippet. Layne Staley sighted at 3 a.m. withdrawing cash at the 7-Eleven. Fans started waiting in bushes for a chance to get near him. To make matters worse, occasionally overzealous admirers would yank on his dreadlocks, leaving his scalp bleeding. Layne tried to hold on to gratitude for the fans, but he couldn't stand the invasion of personal space. By 1990 or 1991, Layne and Demery were informally or formally engaged, with wedding plans that never fully materialized. The rock and roll lifestyle, the ever-intensifying swirl of success and substance use, all wove together in a precarious tapestry. The band landed an opening slot for Van Halen in 1991, carrying on into early 1992. At some point in this whirlwind, Layne began using heroin, though the exact date is hazy. Producer David Jordan recalled visiting the band on tour and noting that Layne was high on cocaine, alcohol, or both, no longer the luminous force he once knew. This was also around the time Layne's father, Phil, a man who had struggled with his own addictions, tried to reconnect after seeing Layne's face on a magazine cover. Stories would later surface of Layne, his father, and other musicians partaking in drug binges together, a twisted reflection of a familial bond that had long been absent. Still, the band pressed forward. In the midst of the Van Halen tour, they recorded an EP called Sap with Rick Parashar, who had produced Pearl Jam. Parashar famously helped develop Alice in Chains' trademark harmonies, layering Jerry and Layne's voices in a way that would define their future sound. Meanwhile, Layne's drug use deepened behind closed doors, with some band members noticing that he'd lock himself in the bathroom for extended periods. The group wanted to keep it hidden, hoping they could just keep the momentum going without addressing the problem too openly. However, by the time they started working on their second album, Dirt, everyone knew Layne's drug habit needed addressing. The label, the band's management, and Layne's family staged an intervention. Layne, for his part, agreed to enter rehab, but it didn't last long. He felt overwhelmed by the lack of anonymity, recognized immediately by other patients, which made him uncomfortable. This was just the first of about a dozen attempts he'd make at recovery throughout his life. Other members of the band also struggled with substance use. Sean Kinney later said, "We partied like maniacs, and it was ugly from 91 onwards." No one wanted to confront the chaos head-on, and everyone was spiraling. Dirt, recorded in early to mid-1992, became the band's masterpiece for many fans and critics, a record saturated with anguish and brutally honest reflection. Lyrical references to heroin, addiction, and self-destruction abounded. However, the album also tackled broader topics: war, depression, relationships, anger, and betrayal. Yet the media naturally fixated on the more shocking subject matter related to drug use. Jerry noted that the tracks on side 2 of the record, From Junkhead to Angry Chair, formed a narrative arc, starting with a kind of naive bravado, drugs are great, rock and roll is awesome, and transitioning into sobering disillusionment. The recording process for Dirt mirrored his dark content. Riots broke out in Los Angeles during their first week of sessions, causing a temporary halt. Danger and desperation surrounded them, including Layne's rumored forays out into the unrest to score drugs. By the end of this grueling effort, Dirt dropped in September 1992 and shot to number 1, 6 on the charts, eventually selling over 4 million copies. Alice in Chains toured extensively in support of the album, from Grunge to Screaming Trees to Ozzy Osbourne. They even hired a security guard specifically to keep an eye on Layne. But by early 1993, problems mounted. Mike Starr's increasingly erratic behavior led to his departure from the band. Layne was distressed by losing his friend from the lineup, though from a management perspective it was deemed necessary. Mike Inez stepped in as their new bassist, and the band soldiered on. That same year, Alice in Chains appeared on the Lollapalooza tour. Layne tried to maintain sobriety by isolating himself in his own tour bus, complete with a makeshift recording setup. Yet by many accounts, he relapsed again on that tour. Old friends who visited him noticed a stark transformation, gloomy artwork, a sense of inner turmoil, the weight of stardom and personal demons gnawing away. By the end of 1993, the band, exhausted and fractured, decided to go on hiatus rather than continue a massive schedule of public performances. Sean Kinney revealed that they simply couldn't keep ignoring the problems. Touring might have destroyed them all had they not taken a break. During this period of rest in early 1994, Layne formed a side project called Mad Season with Mike McCready of Pearl Jam, Barrett Martin of Screaming Trees, and bassist John Baker Saunders. The idea was that Layne would benefit from working with mostly sober musicians, that the environment might support him in a healthier way. Their lone album, Above, came out in 1995 and was a success, earning gold status. However, Layne's personal struggles did not magically vanish. Indeed, in 1994, he invited a friend from an old band, Johnny Bacolis, to move in with him, hoping to find some stability, but Layne set 2 rules. Bacolis was not allowed to pester him about rehab or play any Alice in Chains music in the apartment. Although Bacolis stayed nearly a year, by spring 1995, he could no longer bear the weight of Layne's addiction and left. Layne's own mother also told Bacolis that he was merely enabling Layne rather than helping him. Still, Alice in Chains eventually reconvened in 1995 to make a new album, their self-titled Alice in Chains, often nicknamed Tripod or The Dog Album. The record soared to the top of the Billboard charts, but the band, mired in Layne's ongoing struggle, could not fully tour to promote it. Their major press effort, a Rolling Stone cover story published in early 1996, featured Layne front and center, overshadowed by the headline, "The Needle and the Damage Done." The article peeled back the layers of the band's history and Layne's addiction, revealing in stark detail how far he had descended. Layne spoke candidly about his regret at oversharing personal details, worried that fans would interpret his lyrics in ways that further misunderstood him. He admitted that heroin had once seemed to help him, but now was dragging him through hell. With minimal touring, the album's sales tapered off. Yet, in a surprise move, the band emerged again in the spring of 1996 for a series of public appearances, culminating in a performance for MTV Unplugged in April. It was a legendary session, beloved by fans, but to those paying attention, Layne's physical frailty was evident. Alice in Chains also played on Late Show with David Letterman and another TV special, Saturday Night Special. But these appearances would be fleeting glimpses of a band whose foundation was cracking under the weight of addiction. That summer they accepted a short run of shows opening for Kiss, ironically taking over for Stone Temple Pilots, who were also grappling with addiction issues. These few dates would be the last time Layne ever performed on stage with Alice in Chains. After the final gig on July 3, 1996 in Kansas City, Layne reportedly overdosed and had to be rushed to a hospital. The band flew home with a grim sense that they had narrowly avoided something catastrophic. A few months later, in October 1996, Layne's fiancée and longtime on-and-off girlfriend, Demery, died after her own battle with drug use. This loss shook Layne to his core. Close friends remarked that it was the final blow, the event that decisively drained his will to keep fighting. Mark Lanegan of Screaming Trees once observed that Layne never recovered from Demery's death, and that the pain overshadowed every aspect of his life from then on. In 1997, Layne purchased a condo in Seattle's University District, using a corporate entity to keep his name off public records and avoid unwanted attention. There, he became increasingly reclusive. He spent time drawing, watching TV, playing video games, and nodding off. Producer Toby Wright even set up a home studio for him, but Layne seldom used it. There were rare sightings of him around the neighborhood, local art supply stores, pet shops, or comic book retailers. Occasionally, people reported glimpses of a frail, pale figure who looked decades older than his actual age. The rest of Alice in Chains, meanwhile, was dormant in a practical sense, though they remained bound by certain contractual obligations. Jerry Cantrell released his first solo album in 1998, and rumors circulated that Alice in Chains might do something again. Indeed, near the end of 1998, the band recorded 2 tracks, Died, written as a tribute to Demery, and Get Born Again, intended for a greatest hits set. These were the last official Alice in Chains recordings with Layne. His voice, still extraordinary, also appeared that year on a one-off project dubbed Class of '99, organized by Matt Serletic, and featuring Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine and the rhythm section of Jane's Addiction. They recorded a cover of Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall for the horror sci-fi film The Faculty. Layne showed up to the studio hours late, looking shockingly thin and frail, prompting Serletic to call Sony Records and plead for them to help Layne once more. The label's head reportedly replied that they had already attempted countless rehab initiatives with him. Gossip and rumors flourished throughout the late 1990s. One especially bizarre claim was that Layne had lost a finger, prompting the band's management to issue a statement denying it. Even Jerry Cantrell grew irritated by constant inquiries about Layne's condition whenever he gave interviews to promote his own material. A single photograph of Layne from Halloween 1998 at a Jerry Cantrell show is widely believed to be the last known picture of him alive. After that, sightings were fleeting and always underscored how unwell he seemed. Friends, like Duff McKagan, Guns N' Roses, Mark Lanegan, John Frusciante, and Bob Forrest, tried intermittently to coax Layne into rehab. Nothing stuck. Sean Kinney recounted how he'd call Layne several times a week, only to reach a disconnected phone or no answer. One can imagine the sense of helplessness. They could not physically force Layne to seek help. If he refused, what else was there to do? By the early 2000s, Layne had almost vanished from public view. Occasionally, a fan might claim to have seen him at a local bar or shop near his condo, but always describing a spectral figure who was but a faint shadow of the once vibrant performer from MTV Unplugged. According to Toby Wright, there was even a plan in 2002 to have Layne perform guest vocals on a track by the band Taproot. Layne never showed up for the session. Then, in April 2002, everything came crashing down. Layne's family and friends noticed they hadn't heard from him in weeks, which was unusual even by his withdrawn standards. They grew alarmed when his bank account showed no withdrawals over that same span of time. Finally, Layne's mother contacted the Seattle police, who arrived at his condo to perform a welfare check. What they discovered was the heartbreaking end to this chapter. Layne's body, surrounded by drug paraphernalia. The medical examiner later concluded he had been dead for at least 2 weeks, placing his death on April 5th, 2002, the same date Kurt Cobain had died 8 years prior. The official cause was a combination of heroin and cocaine, often referred to as a speedball. He was 34 years old. The coroner's report also pointed out how drastically his physical condition had deteriorated, marking the tragedy of someone who had once possessed such vibrancy, creativity, and potential. In the years that followed, more details emerged. Former bassist Mike Starr claimed that he was the last person to see Layne alive, having visited him on April 4th. Layne was so unwell that Starr suggested calling 911, but Layne reportedly threatened to end their friendship if he did. A heated argument ensued. Starr left, and Layne spent his final hours alone. Starr later spoke about this on VH1's Celebrity Rehab, haunted by guilt and regret. When Layne's body was finally discovered, he was cremated, and a candlelight vigil took place a week later at Kiana Lodge, ironically the very spot where Layne and Demery had once planned to marry. Susan Silver, the band's longtime manager, described him in warm terms as the least likely frontman ever, lacking ego or arrogance, imbued with a sweet nature and sharp wit. Everyone who knew him well spoke of a man who was humorous, gentle, and deeply creative, yet caught in a force that was bigger than he could control. Jerry Cantrell took the news of Layne's death extremely hard, even to the point of picking up cigarettes again, after having quit for 35 years. Sean Kinney described an atmosphere of heartbreak, remembering the sense that if only they could have fully broken the chain of addiction in time, Layne might still have been there. For the band, losing Layne was losing a friend, not just a legendary vocalist. They stopped performing together for several years. It was not until 2006 that Alice in Chains officially regrouped with vocalist William Duvall. They began creating new material, carrying the legacy forward, while openly acknowledging the absence left by Layne's unique talent. Their comeback album, Black Gives Way to Blue, 2009, paid direct tribute to Layne in its title track, as Jerry Cantrell and the rest of the band tried to honor their friend's memory while moving into uncharted territory. The sentiment was that even in the darkest times, there might be a glimmer of hope on the horizon, and that perseverance could lead to healing, however gradual or incomplete. And so the story of Layne Staley reverberates through modern rock history, like a cautionary anthem. A kid who once stared at an Elton John concert with the wide-eyed dream of becoming a rock star found that dream, and then discovered the shadows it could cast. He soared to extraordinary creative heights, crafting songs that remain as vital and resonant today as they were when first recorded. He honed a voice that was both anguished and angelic, an instrument that reached into listeners' chests and twisted their hearts with raw authenticity. Yet, despite his gifts, and perhaps in part because of the swirling chaos fame introduced into his life, Layne fell prey to addiction, a formidable foe that stole his energy, robbed him of relationships, and ultimately claimed his life.